Good day. Today is Saturday, 25th January 2025, and I'm going to begin this program by returning for the third time, for the third day in a row, to the question of whether or not there's been a military aid stop, or indeed an aid stop of any kind, imposed by the new administration upon Ukraine. Now, the sequence is very interesting and very revealing, and it does indicate that something is indeed going on, even though I'm not for the moment entirely clear exactly what it is. But let's begin at the beginning, which for me began on Thursday, when, as I now have recalled, I read Ukrainian reports which spoke about a US aid stop which extended to US military supplies, and which went into significant detail about the nature of that stop. It spoke about how various ports, European ports, were no longer processing American aid supplies, how there'd been cancellations of agreements with various suppliers, that sort of thing. And as I also remember, information about a stop on providing intelligence information to the Ukrainians as well. Well, that information, as I remember, came from Ukrainian sources. And then in the evening, the Pentagon issued a statement which appeared to contradict much of that. In fact, which did contradict much of that. It said that there had been, in fact, no stop of military aid to Ukraine. What was happening is that there's been a suspension of civilian and humanitarian aid in accordance with the provisions of a recent executive order, an executive order which I have discussed previously, made by Donald Trump, which suspended all civilian and humanitarian aid by the United States for a period of 90 days, subject to review. And the Pentagon statement carefully explained that the military aid to Ukraine fell outside this provision and therefore would continue as normal. Well, that was the information I had yesterday, and I discussed it all in my program, and I said that the original story about a suspension of military aid appeared to be untrue. Well, a couple of hours later, we then got an article on Politico. I should say that the article appeared, I became aware of it shortly after I did my program yesterday. I'm not quite sure when it appeared, but I think it appeared shortly after I did my program. Anyway, it reads, State Department issues immediate widespread pause on foreign aid. The stop work orders appear to apply to US aid for all countries except Israel and Egypt. And it's clear that this is not an order that derives exactly from the executive order that Donald Trump made, but it is a supplemental order intended presumably to put the provisions of Donald Trump's executive order into effect, but it is an order, an internal State Department order made by the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio. And the article in Politico goes on to say this: Secretary of State Marco Rubio halted spending Friday on most existing foreign aid grants for 90 days. The order, which shocked State Department officials, appears to apply to funding for military assistance to Ukraine. So that is in Politico, and it appears to have come out after the Pentagon, the Defense Department statement. And then the article goes on to say, Rubio's guidance issued to all diplomatic and consular posts requires department staffers to issue stop work orders on nearly all existing foreign assistance awards, according to the document, which is obtained by Politico. It is effective immediately. And then we go on to read, it appears to go further than President Donald Trump's recent executive order, which instructed the department to pause foreign aid grants for 90 days pending review by the secretary. It had not been clear from the president's order if it would affect already appropriated funds or Ukraine aid. The new guidance means no further action will be taken to disperse aid funding to programs already approved by the US government, according to 3 current and 2 former officials familiar with the new guidance. The order shocked some department officials for its sweeping mandate. State just totally went nuclear on foreign assistance, said another State Department official. We're then told that there are exceptions for Israel and Egypt. And we then have statements, this is all from Politico, 1 current State Department official plus 2 former Biden administration officials said the pause appears to stop aid to key allies such as Ukraine, Jordan and Taiwan. They and others were granted anonymity to discuss sensitive internal government documents. And we're told that this could lead to lawsuits, which is possible, but then and that the State Department spokesman did not immediately respond to requests for comment. And then we go on to read, the omission of Ukraine is particularly troubling to American officials who want to help it defeat Russia. That's actually there. That some American officials apparently still want Ukraine to defeat Russia, even though the widespread universal consensus is that that is no longer possible. But anyway, there you have an article from Politico, which says that Marco Rubio, as Secretary of State, has gone beyond the strict terms of the executive order, Trump's executive order, and has imposed a stop order on all US aid, foreign aid, except to Israel and Egypt. That apparently includes military aid, and that this stop order does apply to Ukraine as well. And then a short time ago, we got a further supplemental report, this time from Reuters, the British news agency. US issues broad freeze on foreign aid after Trump orders review. And the US State Department issued a stop work order on Friday for all existing foreign assistance and paused new aid, according to a cable seen by Reuters, after President Trump ordered a pause to review if aid allocations were aligned with his foreign policy. The cable, drafted by the Department's Foreign Assistance Office and approved by Secretary of State Marco Rubio, said waivers had been issued for military financing for Israel and Egypt. No other countries were mentioned in the cable. And then we're told that the move is cutting off billions of dollars of life-saving assistance provided by the United States to various countries, and much of that. And there's a statement by a former USAID official, Jeremy Konindik. This is lunacy. This will kill people. I mean, if implemented as written in that cable, a lot of people will die, and much of that. But anyway, it looks as if it extends to US aid as well. In other words, US aid is also now stopped from providing funding. Now, what is going on here? Now, I think that we must make a clear understanding that this is an instruction given by the Secretary of State, And the statement that was made on Thursday was a statement made by the Department of Defense. They're different departments. Now, I am not an expert in the American administrative hierarchy. I believe that the Secretary of State is indeed the senior executive officer after the President, but I don't know whether a stop order that he issues extends to the Department of Defense. I assume not. So I assume that when the Pentagon says that the military supply programs that it is undertaking are still underway, and they, in terms of Ukraine, must be the most important. They're the ones where the greatest number of weapons and other equipment are supplied. That aid, I presume, is continuing. These are the weapons that have already been selected by the Pentagon, approved by the Biden administration for delivery to Ukraine, weapons that will be sent out of US stockpiles and that kind of thing. So I presume that aid still continues, but other aid to Ukraine is cut off, and that includes presumably further funding which has not yet been allocated, which could have been used for defense, for military-related supplies. So there is a squeeze on Ukraine, maybe not quite as tough as the squeeze I assumed existed on Thursday, but it is there, and it will be extremely unsettling for the Ukrainians. They will be very, very worried about what is going on, and I don't think there's any doubt that there is a squeeze. As I said, we've now had these reports from Politico and from Reuters. It's no longer just Ukrainian sources. I did briefly wonder after the Pentagon denial whether perhaps there'd been some kind of a misinformation campaign about this whole issue underway, but clearly there hasn't been. It's just that not everything has been made fully clear. Clearly, as I said, there is a squeeze. Politico and Reuters have confirmed it, and they've obtained information from within the State Department and USAID and other agencies that confirms as much. So this is an important development, maybe not a development that should be overstated, but Ukraine is now experiencing a squeeze. Just saying. So that's one point which I think has been, to a certain extent, clarified. Now, for the rest, we've had more news about what President Trump has been up to since he was inaugurated president on Tuesday. Firstly, we are now getting numerous reports about a, shall we say, extremely difficult conversation that he had with the Prime Minister of Denmark. Now, I've gone to the White House website. So far, there is no readout on the White House website of this call. Presumably, at some point, there will be, but as at the time of making of this video, there is not. Anyway, we've had a very vivid account of this telephone call from European sources, and it has appeared in the Financial Times. And I will read it. Donald Trump insisted he was serious in his determination to take over Greenland in a fiery telephone call with Denmark's Prime Minister, according to senior European officials. The President spoke to Mette Frederiksen, the Danish Premier, for 45 minutes last week. So this happened before the inauguration, or so it seems to me. Just saying. The White House has not commented on the call, but Frederiksen said she had emphasized that the vast Arctic island, an autonomous part of the Kingdom of Denmark, was not for sale, while noting America's big interest in it. 5 current and former senior European officials briefed on the call said the conversation had gone very badly. And as to who briefed them about the call, well, the answer, of course, must be Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen and her officials. They added that Trump had been aggressive and confrontational following the Danish Prime Minister's comments that the island was not for sale, despite her offer of more cooperation on military bases and mineral exploitation. It was horrendous, said one of the people. Another added he was very firm it was a cold shower. Before, it was hard to take it seriously, but I do think it is serious and potentially very dangerous. The details of the call are likely to deepen European concerns that Trump's return to power will strain transatlantic ties more than ever as the US president heaps pressure on allies to give up territory. Well, comments like horrendous and fiery suggest a row, a furious row with raised voices. That's one thing. And when we're told that European leaders, European officials were, shall we say, disturbed by the call, well, what you can read from that is that they were profoundly shocked by it. They did not expect Donald Trump, presumably at that time still the president-elect of the United States, to come and speak to a European leader, a European ally, in that sort of way. For the record, just saying, neither Putin nor Xi Jinping, the people who are often referred to as Europe's enemies, have ever addressed European leaders in the manner that apparently Trump spoke to Frederiksen over the course of that call. And, of course, neither Putin nor Xi have ever made demands of the Europeans of the sort that Trump is making and of the sort that Biden also made to an astonishing degree, going, for the moment, actually beyond anything that Trump himself has done. So we can assume a degree of shock across Europe at the result of this call. Now, I'm not going to explore further in this program what this means for relations between the United States and Europe and about Greenland specifically. What I will say is that it does seem as if Trump does indeed intend to follow through on his Greenland initiative. If you'd followed us on the Duran and some of the things I've said on this channel, that would not surprise you, but it seems that European leaders, for some reason, did not expect it. And it is clear to me, at least, that pressure on Europe from the United States is going to grow. Now, I get the same impression, having now read in full Donald Trump's Davos speech. I say Davos speech. He wasn't actually in Davos. And perhaps if you read the speech itself and you see the way it was projected to the participants of the World Economic Forum, you will understand a little bit more about the dynamic of it, because what the participants in the Davos conference would have been exposed to is a gigantic screen in which the enormous image of Donald Trump was projected into some kind of conference room, and in which all of the various participants in the Davos conference are reduced to a kind of physical insignificance. Now, I can't imagine that this was planned by Trump or by his people, but actually that was the effect. And then you had a speech by Trump which joyously and exuberantly went against all the nostrums and cliches and orthodoxies that the WEF has been standing for the last, 50 plus years of its existence, extending all the way back, by the way, to the late 1960s, when it was originally founded as a European Economic Forum. It only became a World Economic Forum several decades later. So again, I'm not going to read all of Trump's speech. It was not particularly long, by the way, but there's only that much time in the program. But it was striking how Trump joyously recited all the various policies and actions and decisions that the Biden administration had taken, that he had scrapped on climate, on the various identity issues, which he described as nonsense, on DEI, on all sorts of things of that kind, one after the other, going right through them to an audience of people who up to now have been keen to embrace all of these policies. And there is plenty of article about this in the Financial Times, which again gives an impression of a certain sense of shock, of feeling that the people of Davos, if I can call them that, felt like they were being knocked out by an out of control express train, a locomotive that steamed right over them. But it also spoke about how the various Americans in the room, various business people and people like that, that they came away with a kind of exuberance, that they were enthused by the exuberance of of Trump's approach, and by his systematic demolition of what had happened under the Biden administration, and the reversal of all the policies that the Biden administration had been carrying out, which, as I said, were the ones that the WEF had itself preached and approved of. One almost gets the sense that even for parts of the American business community, who are now obviously looking forward eagerly and anxiously to the massive tax cuts and deregulation that Trump is promising, and which, by the way, he promised also in his speech in Davos. But one gets the sense that there is a relief that Biden is gone. There's even a kind of sense that a sort of miasma has been lifted from the United States and its people. And I can, up to a certain point, understand why. Now, Dr. Jack Rasmus, who, unlike me, is an actual economist and an academic and somebody who takes a keen interest in the US economy and who writes about it in a very astute way, has written a very interesting takedown of the Biden economy for the World Financial Review. And its title is Biden's Pernicious Economic Legacies. And he points out, firstly, that under Biden, inflation was indeed very high. Attempts to pretend otherwise are simply wrong. That US households did indeed experience real declines in their earnings. And that ultimately, and despite all the hype, GDP growth was quite weak, given the scale of the $3.6 trillion surplus, stimulus that the Biden administration showered upon the US economy. Gross domestic product, I'm now reading from Dr. Rasmus, the measure of how much the real economy grew, was not all that impressive, given the huge fiscal stimulus Biden introduced into the economy during his 4-year term. For example, his March 2021 American Relief Plan, designed to provide support to the general economy as it tried to reopen in 2021-2022 from the 2020 shutdown, amounted to $1.9 trillion in government spending and tax cuts. And then Dr. Rasmus points out that despite the scale of that stimulus, there was still a recession, except we weren't permitted to call it that in the first half of 2022. So the Biden administration then launched yet another massive stimulus, and there were 3 business investment subsidy bills: the Infrastructure Bill, the Chip and Modernization Act, and the misnamed Inflation Reduction Act that subsidized energy companies, alternative and fossil fuels. Those bills amounted to another $1.7 trillion in fiscal spending and tax cuts. Now, that's a total of $3.6 trillion of fiscal stimulus over the period 2021 to 2022. And as Dr. Rasmus correctly says, this mountain of fiscal stimulus produced a molehill of real GDP growth. GDP recovered in the second half of 2022 after its first half recession, but recorded a meager 1.9% growth rate for 2022. This was followed in 2023 and 2024 with still tepid GDP growth of 22.5% and 2.3% respectively. And this, as Dr. Rasmus points out, is little more, in fact it is no more, than the trend growth figures for the United States economy. And what Dr. Rasmus, the point he's making, is that we've now reached that stage in America's economic history where constant stimulus, constant easing of monetary restrictions, tax cuts, all that kind of thing, fiscal stimulus is beginning to lose its stimulative effect on the economy. This fact strongly suggests that US fiscal monetary policies are barely working anymore as instruments of economic stabilization. Biden thus leaves the legacy of a failure to correct this apparent crisis of US traditional fiscal monetary policies, failure to stimulate real economic growth, or conversely, one might add, to significantly curb inflation long term as well. And I think that is absolutely correct. We are now in a situation where there's been so much stimulus spending for so long in the United States that engaging in more of it is exactly what John Maynard Keynes once famously spoke of: pushing on a piece of string. It doesn't do what it is meant to do, at least only if it does do anything, it does it to a increasingly declining extent. And the result, of course, is sagging growth. The GDP numbers may appear stable, but bear in mind all of this stimulus is probably supporting them to some extent nonetheless. And the overall condition of the economy is in fact gradually and steadily deteriorating. A point we've made many times on the Duran is that all other things being equal, an economy which is supposed to be growing, but where real living standards are declining, is a paradox. Either the number of people who are benefiting from the growth is becoming very concentrated, which makes the growth extremely unstable, or there is no real growth at all. In fact, what you could argue is that there is growth in debt and things of that kind. Well, American business is probably aware of all of this, at least to some degree, and one can understand why, with the passage of Joe Biden, there is finally that feeling that the miasma has lifted. And perhaps Trump, with all of his exuberance, with his talk of tax cuts and drawing investment from all kinds of places around the world into the United States, why that might change things in a big way. Whether they will or whether they won't is another matter. But anyway, to come back to the question, the leading question that takes up most of these programs, which is the relationship with Russia and with Ukraine. I think all of these actions by Donald Trump, the talk of tariffs, the talk of increasing taxes on other forms of taxes on importers into the United States, the talk of tariffs against all kinds of unfriendly countries, that all taken together with the approach he's taken to at his Davos speech, does, to me at least, put some of his comments about imposing taxes, tariffs, and sanctions onto the Russians if they don't capitulate and agree to whatever plan he eventually comes up with to end the conflict in Ukraine. It does put it in a kind of context, because what Trump is in effect threatening the Russians with is what Trump is now threatening everyone with. As I said, American business people are excited about it. Others, the Europeans, obviously, much less so. I wonder what other countries, Japan, even Taiwan, major exporters to the United States that they are, how they will feel about all of this. I wonder what India will feel about all of this. This is all completely consistent, in my opinion, with what I discussed on this channel about 10 days ago, and what we discussed on the Duran about Trump wanting to rebuild America from the inside, whilst at the same time drawing back into spheres of influence, Greenland, the Panama Canal, those kind of things. And it doesn't seem as if, in reality, anything has changed there, or that the policy has moderated at all. The Russians, who are actually ahead of the game on this, there's been a long piece that I read in which they discuss a world in which the United States starts to take a more traditional great power approach, great power competition and spheres of influence and that sort of thing. The Russians are not the only ones who are going to have to adapt to this. Everyone will. And of course that affects the progress of the conflict in Ukraine as it affects other things. Now let's then return to the topic of the conflict in Ukraine. So the Russians, who obviously read the American media and listen carefully to what the Ukrainians themselves are saying in their social media posts and in their media too, are now aware that for around 90 days, Ukraine is the subject of some sort of American aid cut-off. It does not yet extend to weapons deliveries. But that might be because at the time when Secretary of State Rubio made his order, the Defense Department did not have its own Secretary of State. Peter Hegseth, Trump's pick, had not yet been confirmed by the Senate. He now has been. The Senate has confirmed him on a tie vote with the Vice President, J.D. Vance, voting to confirm him. So Pete Hegseth is, as of now, the Secretary of Defense of the United States. Now, what his policies and intentions with respect to the Ukraine war are, I'm not able to say, and I'm not going to discuss, but I will say this. If we start getting orders from Pete Hegseth in the Defense Department similar to those made by Marco Rubio, I won't be completely surprised. But if that happens, it will set alarm bells ringing in Kiev and across Europe to the level of a cacophonous din, suffice to say. Whether Hegseth is going to do that is, of course, another matter. Here I perhaps quickly should make one quick point, which is that a number of people, but one in particular, have written to me asking the question of whether perhaps Trump's tough comments about Russia were in part intended to help get his cabinet picks confirmed. And I would say the answer to that almost certainly is yes. The problem is that we never know with Trump what element how any particular factor plays in any of the comments or decisions that he makes. But clearly, if Trump had been saying over the last couple of days that he intended to meet with Putin as soon as possible and was going to agree to a peace in Ukraine, which would essentially require Ukraine, whose regime he abhors, to capitulate, well, that would surely have caused him some trouble with some of the Republicans in the Senate, and Trump obviously wanted to avoid that. He's also, by the way, what I suspect is going to be his single most difficult pick, Tulsi Gabbard. He's also got to worry about her. She is not yet confirmed as Director of National Intelligence. She apparently goes before the Senate committee on the 30th of January. This will be a tense meeting. The Democrats are deeply antagonistic to her. And in the case of Pete Hegseth, the Republican rebellion was limited to the three well-known anti-Trumpists, hardline anti-Trumpists, Mitch McConnell, of course, but also Collins and Murkowski. We'll see whether the Republican line holds on Tulsi Gabbard on the 30th of January. She was once a Democrat, after all, though she is a decorated American soldier, just saying. And I noticed that she now has the backing of the Federalist, which is one of the leading lights in the MAGA movement. So anyway, we will see what happens. But obviously this has played a role in Trump's decision making. But anyway, coming back to the Russians, they are aware that Ukraine is being placed by Trump under a squeeze. And they were presumably aware of that already yesterday, because the Russians have now weighed in with a whole series of further statements over the last 24 hours. And these statements begin with the most important Russian of all, who is, of course, President Putin of Russia. Now, this was done in a staged interview with Pavel Zarubin, the Russian journalist who, as I've said many times, is essentially a semi-detached member of Putin's team. So this was clearly a staged interview, and I'm going to read it in full. It's not long. So this took place yesterday in the evening in Moscow, and Zarubin's question was, Mr. President, that's to say Putin, newly inaugurated President Trump has made multiple statements about a possible meeting with you and prospects for a Ukrainian settlement. I would like to know what you think about this. And then Putin replied, indeed, the US president has made many statements to this effect. My first point is that Russia has never turned down contacts with the US administration, and it is not our fault that the previous administration chose not to establish such contacts. I have always had businesslike, strictly businesslike, but at the same time pragmatic and trust-based, I would say, relationships with the current president of the United States. In other words, he worked well with Trump. They weren't friends, they weren't close. All of those allegations that Putin was somehow controlling Trump were nonsense, but they did manage to work quite well with each other when they were allowed to. I cannot but agree with him, that is to say, Putin cannot but agree with Trump, that if Trump had been president, if his victory had not been stolen from him in 2020, then maybe there would not have been the Ukraine crisis that broke out in 2022. Now, there is a bit of sincerity here and a bit of flattery. The Russians, long ago, started to say to each other that there had been problems with the 2020 election. So Putin saying this now is not actually new. Putin saying that if Trump had been re-elected in 2020, the Ukraine war would not have happened. That is new. And of course, it's difficult to know to what extent it is true, because none of us can go back into the past and change the course of history. Trump, of course, says it all the time. So here we have Putin being gracious to Trump. Yes, you were the real winner of the 2020 election. We all know it. And yes, you're probably right. If you had been president, there wouldn't have been a war. And then Putin, however, immediately goes on to qualify that. However, it is a known fact that when he was the 45th president, he imposed a significant number, the largest number of restrictions, sanctions on Russia. I do not think that decision was in the best interests of Russia or the United States. By the way, Biden picked up the baton and imposed even more restrictions on us. We are all aware of the results. A lot of those decisions were detrimental to the economy of the United States itself. For example, the power of the US dollar was undermined because Russia's ban on using the US dollar is causing serious damage to the United States itself. We did not refuse to use the US dollar. The previous administration prevented us from using it as a unit of payment. But I will not go into all that now. All I can say is that we hear the the current president saying he is ready to work together. We remain open to that. And then, so Putin says, all those sanctions you imposed on us, they were not a good idea. Yes, they did affect our economy, but they've also affected yours. And what they've ultimately done is that they weakened general trust in the dollar. And then Putin goes on to say this. Regarding talks about Ukraine, we have consistently made it clear, and I wish to underscore it one more time, we remain open to them. Here, too, certain matters need our particular attention. For instance, it is well known that back when he was a fairly legitimate head of state, the current leader of the Kiev regime, an interesting way, by the way, of referring to Zelensky, just saying, issued an executive order prohibiting talks. How can talks be resumed now that they have been outlawed? This meeting, he means the meeting between himself and Zarubin, is taking place in the building of Moscow University. As you may be aware, I am a trained lawyer. I've been saying this program after program for many, many years now. And here we have none other than Vladimir Putin confirm the fact. In fact, he is not merely a trained lawyer. I believe that he has been at some point in his life a practicing lawyer. I don't believe that somebody who is as steeped in legalism as Putin is cannot have been. But this is a big topic for another day. As you may be aware, I am a trained lawyer. I graduated from the law department of St. Petersburg University, formerly Leningrad University. I can tell you that if talks begin based on the existing legal framework, they would be, strictly speaking, illegitimate, meaning that the outcome of such talks could likewise be declared illegitimate. The current Kiev regime appears quite content to receive hundreds of billions from its benefactors and, excuse me for using this homely phrase, pig out on this money like there is no tomorrow. However, it shows little haste in acting on the instructions issued by its sponsors, and we know that they have indeed issued such instructions to rescind the executive order banning talks. Now, those are an interesting set of comments because Putin, first of all, returns to the perennial topic that he brings up. He says, I have always insisted that Russia is fully prepared to conduct talks. We're prepared to talk to anybody who wishes to. We're prepared to talk to Ukraine. We're prepared to talk to the United States. We're prepared to talk to other countries that are interested on the subject of Ukraine. The people who rule out negotiations are not us, but the Ukrainians. It is the Ukrainians who refuse to conduct negotiations. And they have not only refused to conduct negotiations, but they themselves, specifically Zelensky, have prohibited them. And Putin says that the Ukrainians have been told several times by people who Putin calls Ukraine sponsors, in other words, by the West, for heaven's sake, rescind that decree. But then they go on taking the money the West continues to give them, whilst refusing to rescind the decree and refusing to engage in talks. Now, bear in mind that Putin is saying all of this, even as he must know as of the time when he's making these comments, that the United States had in fact already taken steps to suspend at least some flow of funds to Ukraine. He will have been aware of some of the articles that were appearing in the United States. He'd have been aware of the chatter that was appearing in the Ukrainian social media and other places. So he would have had maybe not the extended knowledge that we have today, but he would have had some sense of what is happening. And then Putin goes on to say, nonetheless, I'm of the opinion that ultimately those who provide the funding should compel him to act, and I believe he will have no choice but to comply. Until this executive order is rescinded, it is rather difficult to talk about starting and, more importantly, finishing these talks in a proper way. Preliminary plans may indeed be outlined, but engaging in serious talks remains a particularly difficult proposition, especially considering the ban imposed by the Ukrainian side. Now, this is interesting because Putin is basically calling for a cut-off of financial aid to force Ukraine to rescind its decree and go ahead with talks. He would have known that something like that is happening. And, of course, we know more about that today. That does appear to be the situation we are in now. And does this tally with Donald Trump's repeated comments that Zelensky is prepared to do a deal? Is what is happening a sign that the Americans and the Russians have perhaps somehow or other had some contacts and come to some kind of an understanding that the aid flow to Ukraine must stop in order for Zelensky to scrap his decree refusing talks? And is that why we've got this aid suspension now? Well, I don't want to move too far ahead. I think these are difficult pieces to put together. I don't know, for one thing, how extensive the discussions between the Americans and the Russians have really been. But anyway, there it is. That's what Putin has been saying. Now, he did say a number of other things, and they are interesting. He said that, for example, that it's perfectly true that the United States is a major oil producer and Russia is a major oil producer. In fact, they're the three biggest oil producers and exporters, together with Saudi Arabia. And again, whilst fully aware of all of the talk of imposing tariffs and sanctions and taxes on the Russian oil industry, Putin then went on to say this: what makes the Russian and, let's say, the US economy stand out? We are not just among the largest energy producers, we are also amongst the largest energy consumers, which means overly high prices are bad for both our economies because energy is used to produce other goods inside the country. Overly low prices are bad too because they undermine the energy company's investment potential. We have things to discuss. There are other issues in the energy sector that may be of mutual interest. By the way, I doubt that the current US president, Mr. Trump, to reiterate, we worked together when he was president the first time, will make any decisions, even though we hear words about the possibility of imposing more sanctions on Russia. I still doubt that he will make decisions that will be bad for the US economy. He is not just a smart person, but he is also a pragmatic person. And I have a hard time picturing him making decisions that will harm the US economy. So indeed, it makes sense for us to meet based on the realities of today, to sit down and discuss without haste the areas that are of interest to the United States and Russia. We are ready to do that, but again, this first of all depends on the decisions and choices of the current administration. So here you have an example of what an extremely clever man Vladimir Putin is. Because he hears all of this talk that's coming from Trump about imposing more tariffs and taxes and sanctions, including on the Russian energy sector. And what he says to Trump is, look, let's come together and talk. Let's just talk about all of this. First of all, if you're talking about Ukraine, well, we've never refused talks. So, I mean, this business about imposing sanctions upon us because we've refused talks is really wrong, because the people who are refusing to talk are the Ukrainians. They've got this decree. You've cut off their funding now, so maybe they'll rescind it. We can move on and we can discuss Ukraine. But when you talk about oil and energy and all that, well, actually, we have a great deal in common. You and I have a really great deal in common with each other, because we both lead to big continental economies. We are both of us huge energy producers, but we are also big energy consumers. Contrary to what you think, we actually do have a very big manufacturing industry. After all, we are able at the moment to produce many more weapons than you can do. And we wouldn't be able to do that if we didn't have a big manufacturing industry. You also have a big manufacturing industry. Both of us want to make our manufacturing industry even bigger. So both of us need to find that sweet spot in terms of energy prices. A sweet spot where energy prices are not too high, which will deter manufacturing from expanding because energy costs will be too high, and not too low, which will prevent our energy industries from investing and developing. So why quarrel and argue about something like this when we have so much in common? Why not sit down and talk and work it all through? It's pitched directly to the transactional side of Donald Trump. It understands his own ambitions for the US economy extremely well. And it tells Trump, well, you will find in Russia a partner if you want to work with us, not an adversary, because as our economy is in some respects configured very similarly to your own, we have things with you in common which no one else does. Now, I don't know whether Trump will hear any of this or whether this will just go over his head, though most probably Putin will repeat this when he and Trump meet each other eventually. But I can say that these words have spooked Zelensky. He has been making comments warning about the manipulative quality of Putin's words. And in a sense, yes, they are manipulative, though coming from Zelensky, that's a bit rich for him to say. But the point is, what makes this kind of pitch particularly effective, perhaps even attractive to someone like Trump, is that it is based on an actual truth. The Russians don't want sky-high energy costs, which will curtail the development of their manufacturing industry. And inflict upon them what is known as Dutch disease, a situation where all the investment goes into the petrochemical and energy industries. They want an energy price, an oil price, which will keep the energy industries profitable, but also which will provide enough space for the Russian industrial program to develop and continue. And arguably, Donald Trump should want the same thing for the United States. And when Putin says that the Russians can play a role in making this happen, given that alongside the Americans and the Saudis, they're one of the big three oil exporters, he's absolutely right. So anyway, it's an extremely clever set of comments from Putin, reminding everybody about where the problems with negotiations have come from the Ukrainians, not the Russians, pointing to the fact that the previous sanctions have not actually worked out at all well for the United States. They've affected dollar supremacy and driven countries away from the dollar, and then suggesting to Trump, as I said, let's not argue about sanctions and oil tariffs and things like that. We've got all of these things in common with each other. Let's sit down and agree something that will be of benefit to both of our economies and both of our peoples. I've said it many times, and many people have said it. Vladimir Putin has been called many things. Very, very few people have called him stupid. In fact, as we can see, he is an exceptionally clever man. Now, Putin has not been the only important Russian official who has been speaking over the last 24 hours. Another has been the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov. And he's given a massive press conference, which the Russian Foreign Ministry has broken down into segments, and in which he discusses the way forward with respect to any potential negotiations with Ukraine. And I'm going to say briefly that he's not giving an inch. And here, let us be under no doubt, Lavrov is his master's voice. I have no doubt that what Lavrov is saying has been coordinated with Putin himself. And these are some of the things that Lavrov said over the course of the press conference. Russia has pointed out on numerous occasions that it is ready for talks on a settlement in Ukraine. We stand for a truly final, just and lasting solution based on the elimination of the root causes of that crisis. A temporary ceasefire and a conflict freeze are unacceptable solutions. The West will inevitably use them to reinforce the Kiev regime's military potential and to take revenge. We want reliable and legally binding agreements with mechanisms guaranteeing the non-resumption of the conflict. There is a foundation for this. That is, the solutions coordinated in the spring of 2022 during several rounds of Russian-Ukrainian talks in Belarus and Turkey, and with due regard for the situation on the ground and the positions President Putin put forth during his meeting in the Foreign Ministry in June 2024. A peaceful settlement is hindered by the policy and behavior of Kiev and the West. And then he goes into some of the detail. He discusses how Kiev walked away from the Istanbul Agreement. It was under persuasion from the British. He complains about Zelensky's peace formula. I've discussed that in many places, a formula capitulation for Russia. He complains about the Copenhagen format created by Jake Sullivan in 2023, and then the equally unsuccessful Burgenstock Peace Summit in 2024. He says any attempts to revive any of that is going to fail, and he also complains about the fact that President Zelensky has lost legitimacy. His presidential term ended on May 20th, 2024, and that, here I'm quoting Lavrov, President Putin has said that following that he has ceased to be a legitimate head of state, and hence his signature on any documents will have no legal validity. And he also discusses at some length the prospects of US-Russian relations. He says that under the Biden administration, relations between Russia and the United States have deteriorated significantly and are now precariously close to a complete breakdown. The hybrid war initiated by Washington, with the overt doctrinal objective of inflicting a strategic defeat on Moscow by employing the Kiev regime as a proxy, has of course not succeeded, but has contributed to the bilateral confrontation, acquiring a protracted systemic nature. Trump's return to the White House following last November's presidential election significantly alters the political landscape within the United States from the perspective of Russian-American relations, given the bipartisan Russophobia consensus that has developed, premised on the perception of Russia as an existential threat to American hegemony. No substantial positive developments should be anticipated. Certainly, we take note of the signals emanating from Donald Trump's team, as well as the contradictory and often flamboyant statements of the new head of state. Concurrently, we acknowledge the bold, by American standards, promises to revive interstate dialogue, which was effectively suspended under Joe Biden. We will observe what emerges from this, but the inclination to establish direct communication is in itself commendable. If it becomes possible to restore our relations to even a semblance of normality, including the functioning of the ambassadors in Washington and Moscow, such progress would represent a notable achievement. Nevertheless, it must be emphasized that we are not harboring any illusions about the new old president. During his first term, contrary to expectations, the deterioration of bilateral ties initiated by Barack Obama persisted, and Donald Trump surpassed his predecessors in the scale of sanctions imposed against Russia. Should the Americans consider our interests, dialogue may gradually resume. Should they fail to do so, the situation will remain unchanged. So what Lavrov is doing is he is again restating in full the Russian position on Ukraine on the basis that the Russians will negotiate with Ukraine. It has not shifted by one dot or punctuation mark. The Russians stand firm on the positions that Putin outlined in his June 2024 speech to the Foreign Ministry. But Lavrov, echoing to some extent Putin, says, well, at the same time, we're not being wholly negative about what is going on. We've heard Trump, we know his flamboyant statements, we don't know whether or not, we don't know how serious some of his statements actually are. We are, however, prepared to speak with him, and if dialogue is established again and we have proper functioning embassies again in our respective capitals with actual ambassadors in place, well, that will be in itself a significant step forward over the terrible position we are in today, where there is, to all intents and purposes, no dialogue at all. So Lavrov, in some respects, appears to think that an agreement to end the war in Ukraine is going to be beyond reach. He doesn't think that the Americans are prepared to make any fundamental adjustments to their positions. And nonetheless, he still hopes that something can be achieved, even if that is only the establishment of some kind of proper, functioning communication again between the Americans and the Russians. A resumption of superpower contacts of a kind that were never interrupted at any point during the Cold War. Well, that's Lavrov. Now, another senior Russian foreign ministry official has spoken, and that is Sergei Ryabkov. And Ryabkov is, of course, a Russian deputy foreign minister, and he is the person who I would expect, my guess is, if there are going to be negotiations, whether over Ukraine or over the entire strategic landscape in Europe, or indeed Eurasia, as the Russians are saying, I expect that it will be Ryabkov who will be Russia's key negotiator. Anyway, Ryabkov also had a meeting with Russian journalists on Friday, or yesterday, and he said this: I would first like to understand what basis the United States intends to use to move towards a settlement. And he mentioned the settlement of the conflict in Ukraine. He said that it is a difficult project. And if they are based on the signals we have heard in recent days, then it won't work, neither in 100 days, nor even longer. And Ryabkov made it clear that he does not expect any kind of negotiation to settle the Ukraine conflict to be completed within 100 days. But if the process is all based on the proposals that have been flying around in Ukraine and the West, freezes, ceasefires, European peacekeepers, NATO membership suspended for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, then, as you put, it won't work, neither in 100 days, nor even longer. I think the Americans need to start listening to these Russian points. And it's an obvious basic principle, I would have thought, in negotiations, that before you enter into them, you get to know and understand the position of the other side. And that, of course, requires proper discussion with the other side, which up to now has not happened. Now, Marco Rubio, the new Secretary of State, has had a conversation with Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister. There's been no word yet of any direct contact between the Trump administration and Moscow. Let's wait and see whether or not it will happen, and how it will happen, and what form ultimately it will take. Now, the United States does have, or at least the Trump administration does have, it seems to me, a very real need and interest to talk to the Russians if it is going to pursue its wider agendas. There's talk that the administration wants to reduce US forces in Europe by 20%. Bloomberg is reporting that the Trump administration has made clear that the United States has no intention of engaging in recovery assistance in Ukraine post-war irrespective of the outcome of the war. That appears to quash ideas that Ukraine is going to be at the receiving end of a vast amount of American investment. It looks as if Zelensky's recent attempts to bait the Americans by talking up the vast mineral wealth and grain wealth, food production wealth of Ukraine is falling on deaf ears with the Trump people. Lindsey Graham might have been influenced by it, but it seems that Donald Trump and the people immediately around him are not. They want to concentrate on developing places closer to home, like Greenland, for example. So they're not interested in Ukraine. Logically, if they want to focus on the development of the United States, re-enter a period of great power competition, challenge China in the Indo-Pacific, withdraw their forces from Europe, they need to stabilize the situation in Europe. And the only party that can help them do that is Russia and no one else. The Europeans can make promises of increased arms spending, but history has shown that these promises never amount to what the Americans expect and hope they will. And given the state of the economies in Europe, they won't amount to that this time. So a dialogue between the Americans and the Russians ought to be of interest to the Americans. And given that the Russians have also repeatedly expressed the security of their western border as their major priority, one could see how at some point and in some place the interests of these two countries could converge. Putin has now just added a further one when he talks about the similarities, certain similarities in the structure of the Russian and American economies as energy producers, and why they both might want to work towards the same sweet spot in oil prices. The question is whether the United States and Russia can get through the problem of Ukraine in arriving at this point, and what will happen if they can't. And here I think again that each side has a potential reason for a certain degree of restraint if they understand their interests properly. The Russians, as I've said many times, probably do not want to push too far westwards, reach all the way to the Polish border, incorporating western Ukrainian regions where they have been historically disliked, in a way that would create a permanent crisis in Europe of the kind that existed during the Cold War, a crisis which would keep the Americans in. And the Americans presumably don't want that outcome either, given all the other things that Donald Trump wants to do. That is what the leaders of these two countries need to keep in mind. Now, the Russians, I think, understand this. They are long-term planners, after all. I'm not entirely sure yet whether the Americans do. So it will be interesting to see what kind of discussions take place and where those discussions go, though I don't think anyone should expect any very quick and hasty end to the war in Ukraine. Meanwhile, there has been an article in the Wall Street Journal which has poured cold water on the theory that the new sanctions that Trump is threatening are going to fundamentally change Russian calculus. The article is unusual in that it actually reaches out to actual Russian commentators, people in Russia, specifically in the Higher School of Economics, which is one of the major academic institutions, or the most prestigious academic institutions in Moscow. And they all say the same thing, that yes, there are imbalances in the economy, but these are not so grave as to cause worries about a crisis or to lead the Russians to change their approach to the war. Military production is able to keep up with the demands of the war, and for the moment, Russia is able to replace losses. One Russian commentator said that the Russians certainly would be able to keep advancing for at least another year. I don't know why he thinks it would be only a year, by the way, but anyway, that's what he said. And but for the record, Lavrov himself, somewhere over the course of this same interview, has said that it's ridiculous to think that the Russians need a ceasefire or are exhausted. They're not asking for a ceasefire, and they're not exhausted. They are advancing. An army that is advancing, logically, is not an exhausted one. So, there's not going to be some kind of button or lever that Donald Trump can press that is going to shift the Russians in any significant way. But that doesn't mean that he doesn't have good reasons to speak with them and to meet with Putin, and hopefully before long he will. And I hope that for once he listens as well as speaks. Now, that brings me now quickly to what is going on in the war. Well, the first thing to say is that there's been absolutely terrible stories about the conditions of the Ukrainian troops still fighting in Velikaya Novosilka. They're, according to most reports, the Russians now control around 70% of this small town. I get the sense that there's no really coherent fighting going on. There's a few places where people are resisting. Ukrainian soldiers are still resisting. But the Russians, knowing that Velikaya Novosilka is about to collapse, are in no hurry to sacrifice lives to complete the task. The Russian Defense Ministry has said that Velikaya Novosilka is the last significant military position the Ukrainians hold in southwestern Donbass, and they're absolutely right. The battle for Velikaya Novosilka is entering a harrowing end. Ukrainian troops abandoned in the town, refused permission to surrender, apparently concentrating in certain sections in the northern part of the town, huddling together, if you like, making occasional desperate efforts to break out and escape. It is a disaster worse than Ugledar. It reminds me in some respects of Ugledar, but it is actually worse, because in the case of Ugledar, and incidentally, somewhat to my surprise, the size of the garrison in Velikaya Novosilka turned out to be about the same size as the size of the garrison in Ugledar. It's about 2,000 men, as far as I can tell. Anyway, in both cases, the garrison was essentially cut off from resupply, and largely surrounded and subjected to bombing and shelling and that kind of thing. But in Ugleda, there was at least a line of retreat, however terrible, across the cold fields. In Velikaya Novosilka, there appears to be none. Anyway, most reports I've seen suggest that today will be the last day. We shall see. Everywhere else, also, the Russians continue to push forward. They're pushing forward in near Pokrovsk. There's been more pictures of further Russian advances in the village of Udachny. They're now said to be, by the way, within 3.5 kilometers of the border with Dnipro region. I'm not sure how significant that is, by the way, but anyway, people have been talking a lot about that. They are advancing, they're gradually beginning to advance north of Vozdvizhenka, and some people think that this is more to do with an operation, an ultimate operation against Konstantinovka, the town, the small town, the small city actually. It's about 70,000 people, south of Kramatorsk, which the Russians are expected to attack in the spring, now that the battles of Chasov Yar and Toretsk are about to end. I suspect that the Battle of Toretsk has already ended. I think that probably by now the coal mine, the last remaining coal mine, probably has been cleared of the Ukrainian defenders. And pictures I've seen of Chasov Yar suggest that there's barely any of this town left now. At least no significant part of this town left now that is under Ukrainian control. Meanwhile, the Kalashnikov concern is profiling its new AI-guided drones. Meanwhile, the Kalashnikov concern is profiling its new AI-guided drones. It's publicized pictures of two drone families that it has developed and apparently placed in production. Again, it's difficult for me to evaluate the significance of this development, but a year ago, all kinds of people were saying that Ukraine would turn the tide against the Russians by unleashing fleets of AI-guided drones that would be able to attack the Russians and which would be immune to Russian jamming, and it has never happened. And insofar as there seems to be a race to develop AI drones, well, the Russians appear to be winning it. By the way, some weeks ago, I saw an article on one of the American military magazines about the resistance within the Department of Defense in embarking on the kind of drone procurement, small-scale drones, FPV drones and Lancet type drones that have been so ubiquitously used in the war. The US Department of Defense apparently is resisting pressure to engage in large-scale procurement of these drones, and it continues to remain committed to the big Reaper and Predator type drones which have formed the American drone arsenal since it began to develop in the 1980s. I find that, in some respects, both astonishing and unsurprising. Many military writers in the United States, people like Douglas McGregor and David Davis, have complained about the US military's sluggish response to military developments. And if so, this is an example of one. Maybe Pete Hegseth, who has a very different background. He's not been a high-ranking general like his predecessor, Lloyd Austin. He's not come from the defense military industrial complex. He's been much closer to the action. In fact, he has been in action, as he pointed out during his confirmation. He's led men in battle. Maybe he understands the importance of this development, the changes in drone technology that the Ukrainian war has highlighted, and being more in touch with the needs of the regular infantry. He's going to make efforts to shift direction towards procurement and production of these types of drones. But anyway, with every day, the Russians chip away at more of Ukraine's defenses. As I said, I think Toretsk is done. I suspect Chasiv Yar will be very soon. Velikaya Novosilka perhaps today. Ukrainians held out longer there than I'd expected, but at the cost of an entire brigade, which seems to me completely senseless. And Ukraine has to now deal with the problem of a cut-off, at least a partial cut-off, of US assistance. One would like to think that all of this will concentrate minds in Kiev, but no, there is no sign of that. And until we see what Putin and Trump are able to do, the war will go on. Well, this is where I finish today's program. There'll be more from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.